So how often do couples in relationships actually cheat? And what are the root causes as to why this happens? In today's video, we are not just going to break that down as somebody who's literally had tens of thousands of conversations through first running a very, very busy private practice with clients for years and years, and then moving into our online programs where I've worked with tens of thousands of people. I will break down to you not just the information there, but also how this tends to pan out per attachment style. So we'll talk about all of the different attachment styles, whether they're dismissive avoidant, fearful avoidant, anxious attached, and secure. And I think some of these things might really surprise you. First, let's start by discussing how frequently this actually takes place in relationships, and we'll pull from statistics. Now, of course, these are statistics in North America specifically, but I think that it's really important to recognize that these statistics were also anonymous, so it's not like people were answering these questions and polls in front of their partners or with any inkling of thought that somebody could get access to this information. So I think that a lot of these will be quite accurate. And we're going to start by talking about this. Again, then we'll get into the root reasons this happens, and then we'll break this down by attachment style. So which attachment styles are more likely to cheat and why? And in long-term marriages versus unmarried committed relationships, we have different data here. First and foremost, the best long-running data set, which is from the US General Social Survey, finds that about 20% of married men have cheated at some point and about 13% of married women. And this is reporting having done this at least once. So that's roughly 1 in 6 marriages overall. And because infidelity, statistics show us that infidelity actually rises in midlife, which again would be such an important topic we could dive into in so much depth here. But researchers usually estimate that older and longer marriages land a little bit closer to 20 to 25%, according to the Institute for Family Studies. And that is an informed inference from the age curves in the same data. So it's not exact. However, divorce data also lines up. In samples of divorcing couples, about 28 to 60% on the range, women and men, say that infidelity was a factor, but that's among people specifically whose marriage ended. So it overstates the population rate. And it's fair to essentially say, as a takeaway to summarize that first part, and then we'll talk about non-married couples, that people who have been together for a long time, married for a long time, about 1 in 5 will face some sort of sexual infidelity at least once, with men doing this a little bit more frequently than women. Okay, so we have some decent data on there. And I think, people who are insecurely attached, and we'll get into how that sort of spans out here in a few moments, but I think that people who are insecurely attached also end up thinking that, oh my goodness, because this is taking place, everybody cheats. Half of people in marriages cheat. I think that there are a lot of preconceived notions and ideas from people who have seen cheating growing up in their home, or, seen a lot of painful things in relationships growing up, and sort of assume the worst as a self-protective mechanism, which is very common for all insecure attachment styles in different ways. Anxious attachment styles tend to fear cheating a little bit. Fearful avoidants absolutely fear it in relationships. And dismissive avoidants often sort of assume at times that may just be something that plays out in relationships. So we'll get into the attachment part of this in a little bit, but first let's talk about premarital or uncommitted relationships. One 2024 Roundup study reports that 20% of people say that they've cheated before marriage. So even on the way to marriage, 1 in 5 people admit to stepping out. Now you have to remember when you hear this data that this is also people who weren't necessarily in a relationship with somebody that they thought they would spend forever with, right? These are in unmarried relationships. And so a portion of these marriages didn't make it all the way to marriage. And of course, we also know statistically that couples are more likely to cheat when they perceive a relationship to be over, in the final months, right before breaking up with their partner, perhaps, or when they perceive that infidelity might be happening on the other end and there's a breakup. So keep that in mind, that's why this number is slightly higher than what we were looking at around, 1 in 6 marriages overall for married couples. However, some broader relationship polls, again, anonymous, from the Survey Center on American Life, count emotional and online cheating. So people who report ongoing flirtations, perhaps emotional affairs, and again, in non-married couples. So this can also include at times where people are just about to break up or, 3 months before, finally deciding to leave a relationship. But we'll generally see that they climb into the early 40% range of people saying that they think their partner has had some degree of affair, whether it's emotional or some sort of physical cheating. And that's partly because the emotional or cyber infidelity is actually much more common in non-married couples. So for premarital couples, you can basically say somewhere between 1 in 5 and 2 in 5 of people cheat if we're talking cyber flirtation, micro cheating, cyber emotional affairs, things of that nature. And sometimes when you look online, you'll see that these numbers look so much higher. I'm sorry, but it's partly because of some of the media, right? It's because these like private investigator sites and affair apps claim that 70% of people will cheat over a marriage. And those are convenient samples of people already near infidelity. So they overestimate massively the real world rate. And again, this isn't broken down by attachment style. There's so much more that spans in here. And to be honest, I would say that as somebody who's worked with many, many, many people over the years and seen truly the inside of so many people's lives and had people open up to me about all kinds of things you would never imagine. And heard so many stories and, you have a sense that, hey, if somebody's going to tell me this story over here, they would definitely tell me that they're cheating or that they have cheated because I've seen so many variations of that. And remembering too, that I would see sometimes people one-on-one, but I would also see couples, right? So people would really share their inner world. I would say in marriages, I would probably see 1 out of 6 people having cheated or had some sort of like emotional, affair of some degree as being, fairly accurate. I would actually say it's slightly on the lower range, but also remembering that the sample size of people I was working with were people who were also committed to doing the work and coming in to try to heal and grow, right? So of course that's going to skew a little bit lower for me. And then I would also say in non-married couples, 1 in 5 would probably be pretty accurate. I think that that's a pretty accurate representation. And remembering too, that this doesn't account for people who tend to be serial cheaters. I will actually say I have a free course you can check out all about trust in relationships, building trust, and also making sure that you build lasting connection so that trust breaches don't happen. Because a lot of lasting connection is all about vulnerability, depth, open communication, learning how to navigate disagreements and arguments in relationships properly so that disagreements and arguments don't drive you apart, but instead bring you together, right? It's like if you can hash something out that was standing between the two of you and you break it down and you come together over it and you make a healthy compromise, you'll actually feel closer to somebody after if you do conflict right. But if you don't, then of course you're going to feel like conflict festers and creates more distance and more unmet needs and more rationalization and justification. And that's where, you start building roots of infidelity to occur in relationships. It includes trust in the relationship to yourself, because that can also play a bit of a role in how we process these things. If you do things like constantly say yes to people when it's a no for you or violate your own boundaries to people please people, those are breaches of self-trust, right? You're not honoring your truth or your boundaries or your needs. That course you can check out fully for free for 14 days. We do this once a year. It's for Black Friday. So I'll put the link down below. So now I want to talk just for a moment about the serial cheating or people who cheat on a regular basis versus people who, step out on a relationship that's not necessarily a part of how they tend to operate in all their relationships. And then we'll break down attachment specific, okay? People who cheat tend to fall into 2 categories. 10% of people, we have this sort of pathological category. So people who have narcissistic personality disorder, even other potential personality disorders, antisocial personality disorder, sometimes borderline personality disorder, but sometimes that can skew in the exact opposite direction. But also people who struggle with addictions. So sex addiction, who are in active addiction of some form, especially people who might be alcoholics, they're going out all the time, they're drinking. We have people who are sort of falling into this category where the cheating and the chronic cheating is also a representation of their own inner struggles that they're dealing with, and their own inner wounds, right? That they're covering up with sex or cheating or alcohol or drugs or trying to feel like they're getting attention and connection. So these are sort of our serial chronic cheaters here, okay? And again, as I mentioned, that's pretty common for narcissistic personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, some individuals with borderline personality disorder, but they can also skew so far in the opposite direction with extreme preoccupation of not wanting to lose somebody and fearing abandonment that we can see sort of polarities there. And then we have all of these individuals, okay, who they fall into what I would call the other 90%. The other 90% of people, they cheat because of usually 3 things happening. And I'm not sure that I ever really saw an exception to this in all of the thousands of discussions I had with clients, tens of thousands if you include our online programs of discussions I've had with people who talk about cheating. Okay. That 90%, there's sort of three things that tend to happen. Number one, that individual who does the cheating usually first feels like their needs are deeply unmet in a relationship. Now, I think people hear that at first and they think, oh my gosh, the cheater blames the other person and says it's because my partner wasn't meeting my needs. But that's not really what's going on. Usually what's happening is the person who feels their needs are unmet, they don't know how to be vulnerable to their partner. They don't know how to communicate and open up. They don't know themselves well enough to know what their needs actually are in a relationship. So they fall into this trap of feeling, maybe for example, they need their partner to be more present with them or more attuned to them or to spend more quality time with them. And they're not getting it, okay? It's something that sort of floats on the periphery of their conscious mind, right? It's subconscious. They're not realizing that they need this. They just know that they're feeling unfulfilled about something and they feel frustrated by it and disconnected and maybe a little bit hurt by it as well. And, a little bit sad. And with that, there's usually this expectation that like, well, this is my partner. They should be fulfilling me. They should be making me happy. They should. And so we have this sort of 1-2 punch of somebody needing something, not consciously knowing what that thing is, not knowing how to communicate about it, and also just feeling like they're let down by this thing or maybe set of things. It can often be multiple needs not being met. And as a result of that expectation, they come to resent their partner. So we have unmet needs, then we have this resentment, okay, or frustration projected towards the partner, which allows, and this is sort of the third step, for justification to start boiling in. So eventually what then happens is that person, falling in that 90% non-pathological sort of space, they have this built up resentment, oftentimes for years before cheating actually occurs, this buildup of unmet needs, so lack of fulfillment. And then they start to justify and they say things to themselves like, well, my partner wouldn't care anyways, or my partner never makes time for me anyways. And they start to justify. But in particular, at this third step, we usually have somebody who comes into their life externally, or they may seek it out through online spaces or things like that. But somebody comes into this person's life who usually has years of built up resentment and hurt and frustration and not feeling connected in their relationship, and meets those very needs that person was feeling were deeply unmet. So that person might, have this sense of yearning to be seen, and somebody comes into their life and they ask them, really meaningful questions, and they're really present with them and they get really curious. And that person who's been feeling like they were missing that curiosity and that presence and that ability to be seen by their partner and to have intimacy through that emotional connection, they then get it from somewhere else. And oftentimes in this third category, there can usually be some sort of midlife crisis that's also happening. The person's feeling really insecure about themselves, their future. Sometimes it's a job change, a bit of an identity crisis the person's going through. And so there's this usually added insecurity as almost the cherry on top. Not always, but that can really fall into that space. And now this person is trying to fill this void within themselves with this external person. And because they have the resentment and because they have years of unmet needs, they justify. And our subconscious mind is a needs meeting machine. It justifies all it can to try to get our needs met. You've probably seen this if you've ever tried to have like a New Year's resolution of quitting eating chocolate, right? You're like a few days in, you start rationalizing, oh, it's just a little bit, it would be fine. Or we have so many examples of that across the boards. You say you're going to go to the gym every day and then, oh, well, but I hardly slept last night or whatever it is. And so you see your mind rationalize, and people absolutely do this in marriages. Now, how does this actually affect attachment styles? How does this break down by attachment styles specifically? Well, what we see here is number one, anxiously attached individuals out of the 3 insecure attachment styles. So anxious, fearful avoidant, dismissive avoidant, okay? Anxiously attached, the more clingy individuals in relationships, they tend to cheat the least out of the insecure attachment styles, but they do tend to entertain emotional affairs, things I would call micro cheating. Do they do this all the time? Absolutely not. We'd actually be talking sort of skewing lower in that 1-to-6 ratio if they're married couples. But sometimes anxiously attached individuals, they can entertain, more emotional type things. They're less likely to cross the line because they prioritize their relationship so much. But sometimes when they're feeling deeply unfulfilled or frustrated or hurt, and somebody comes in and makes them feel all these things, that's where they may fall prey to this. Dismissive avoidance and fearful avoidance are definitely slightly more likely to cheat when they're feeling unfulfilled in relationships, when these ingredients come to play. Dismissive avoidance tend to cheat more so because they're sometimes lacking that emotional connection, and it's easier for them to justify, almost because dismissive avoidance are so self-focused, right? Dismissive avoidance, if you know much about attachment styles and you're landing on this video, they usually grew up with more emotional neglect. And so they foster dealing with that by creating a tremendous amount of hyper independence. And that hyper independence causes them to go into relationships and essentially focus on themselves still. They tend to, be less vulnerable in relationships, build less of a deep emotional bond. And of course, the less deep of an emotional bond you have and the more disconnected you feel in relationships, the more likely you are to feel in a marriage or a long-term relationship that it's not that big of a deal if you cheat. It's sort of easier to justify if there isn't as much depth and vulnerability and intimacy in a connection. And because this individual is often more, thinking about their own needs and interests because they've been conditioned that way all the way since early childhood, they may fall into the trap slightly more, okay? Fearful avoidance, they have a tremendous amount of depth that they're trying to build, but fearful avoidance, when they feel hurt, angry, frustrated, they do tend to act out in a relationship more frequently. So they do tend to want to push somebody away a little bit more. Both fearful avoidance and dismissive avoidance may cheat as a form of justifying deactivation. So they're both two attachment styles who tend to want to create space and distance by convincing themselves they don't need somebody else and that they'd be okay without them. Fearful avoidants often cheat from sort of internalized spitefulness that takes place over time. That if you think back to those pieces I was talking about, unmet needs for a long time, expectation that the partner should be meeting the needs. Sometimes the fearful avoidant will experience extra frustration, extra hurt, extra anger around that piece, thinking like, why aren't you showing up? Why aren't we connecting? And that can cause them to be more likely to act out. Whereas dismissive avoidance, their relationship to infidelity usually circulates more on their own self-interests, right? Their own thinking about themselves and just feeling unfulfilled, and then not having fostered this depth of connection as much, and constantly trying to deactivate and create space and distance to make themselves feel safe and protected. And so you'll generally see that's where that falls into play. What do we do about these things in relationships? How do we approach these things? Truly, at a high level, a couple of things you really want to get good at. Number one, learning to communicate about needs in a relationship. You stop that first pillar from showing up. And again, if you don't know your needs, that course will really help you with that. Learning to dive in and know your needs, both personally and in relationships, and learn your partners, right? Because if we don't know our needs, we can't communicate them. If you don't know your partner's needs, you're not going to be meeting them very well. And then again, we start leaving this open-ended space for painful challenges to exist. Number two, make sure that you're practicing vulnerability in your relationship. You have to let somebody in. You have to actually broaden and deepen that connection. And number three, if you're feeling resentment in a relationship, resentment festers because communication is not taking place. So when we have resentment, we haven't communicated through things. And so we actually have to go. And even if we start by saying, hey, I feel this distance between us, I feel this frustration towards you, and I don't want to feel that, I don't know why. Can we talk about it? Even if you lead with vulnerability and start there, you're going to have more breakthroughs than if you keep things to yourself and then you try to communicate from frustration or hostility by saying things like, you don't care, you're not showing up, or blaming. None of these things are productive. So looking at it through this lens can be very helpful. So that's it for today. If you enjoyed today's video, please like, share, subscribe to this channel so you don't miss any of our daily videos coming out this month for Relationship Month in the Personal Development School. I'll put the link down below, and hopefully I'll see you next time.